Could E.T. be a Jedi? Does Casper need bustin? Who is the original Roy Batty? All of these answers will shock you. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg have been both lifelong friends and close collaborators on several projects. Spielberg was convinced that Star Wars would be a colossal hit, for example, even when Lucas had his own doubts about the film's success. Spielberg and Lucas agreed to share profits on Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, as they both believed in each other's success. It was Spielberg who was proven right when Star Wars became the highest-grossing film of all time. However, it was Spielberg who stole back the record a few years later when E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial bested Star Wars at the box office. E.T. had a much different take on the science fiction genre compared to Lucas's magnum opus. But that didn't stop Lucas and Spielberg from adding in a few fun Easter eggs that suggest that they each take place within the same universe. There's a scene in E.T. in which Elliot takes his alien friend out to collect candy on Halloween. After seeing a child dressed as Yoda, E.T. says, "Home." And all this is scored by a version of Yoda's theme from The Empire Strikes Back. Does this mean that E.T. has visited the Star Wars galaxy? Well, in The Phantom Menace, a group of aliens that look like E.T. can be spotted in the Galactic Senate. Maybe E.T. had to return home so that he could complete his Jedi training. E.T. isn't the only Spielberg film that contains references to the galaxy far, far away. Famously, Lucas and Spielberg took a vacation during the opening weekend of Star Wars. As they relaxed on the beach, Spielberg told Lucas that he had always wanted to make a James Bond movie.
Bond. James Bond.
Lucas thought that he had an even better idea and pitched his friend Indiana Jones. The two franchises are very similar, of course, as Star Wars was inspired by classic science fiction serials such as Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, while Indiana Jones paid homage to adventure serials from the same era. And a few clever Easter eggs suggest that the events of the Star Wars universe are ancient history in the Indiana Jones timeline. When Indy searches through the Well of Souls in Raiders of the Lost Ark, hieroglyphic images of R2-D2 and C-3PO can be spotted in the background. In Temple of Doom, Indy escapes from a bar named Club Obi-Wan in the film's opening sequence. Meanwhile, a one-shot issue of the non-canon Star Wars Tales comic book series imagined Indy's search for more Star Wars artifacts. Into the Great Unknown finds Indy discovering the remnants of the Millennium Falcon, which has crash-landed on Earth. Duncan Jones is a filmmaker with an admirable commitment to original science fiction projects. Jones's 2009 film, Moon, was straight-up brilliant and featured one of the best performances that Sam Rockwell has ever given. Jones's follow-up, Source Code, was just as compelling. He also deserves credit for making a Warcraft film that wasn't entirely incoherent. That being said, any goodwill that Jones had with sci-fi fans may have disappeared after the release of his film Mute, a science fiction neo-noir that feels like a complete retread of better films. While there are some interesting visuals, the film's world building was confusing and a little dull. It felt very much like all of the creativity of Moon had vanished. But although they seem like polar opposites, Jones has suggested that the two films take place in the same universe. Moon follows astronaut Sam Bell's isolation on the lunar surface, where he discovers the existence of several clones of himself. It's implied that one of Bell's clones returns to Earth after the end of the movie to expose his corrupt employer, Lunar Industries, and the ensuing trial briefly appears on a television screen in Mute.
My name is Sam Bell.
So's mine, pal.
Jones told Entertainment Weekly that the Easter egg was included to satisfy people who cared about Sam's fate after Moon, and he even indicated that a third film could tie the projects closer together.
We got one!
The original Ghostbusters was a standalone science fiction comedy, but that hasn't stopped people from trying to turn it into a blockbuster franchise. Ghostbusters 2 was a disappointing sequel that failed to capture the same comedic charm. 2016's Ghostbusters felt like it was repeating the same story beats, and Ghostbusters Afterlife leaned way too hard on nostalgia. There are even more Ghostbusters films coming too, with an Afterlife sequel set to be released in 2023. and an animated spin-off project also in the works. However, it doesn't sound like any of these new Ghostbusters films will be featuring an appearance by Casper the Friendly Ghost. Dan Aykroyd actually had a brief cameo as Ray Stantz in the 1995 film Casper. Apparently, Ray was able to take a break from his job in New York City and head over to Maine so he could investigate the ghostly trio.
Who are you gonna call? Someone else.
Ghostbusters Afterlife established that there are now numerous units of Ghostbusters working in other offices in different locations. Does this mean that one of these units could run into Casper at some point? Unfortunately, it doesn't seem likely, as DreamWorks Animation bought the rights to Casper before it was bought by NBC Universal. The chances that Universal and Sony could cooperate on a new universe featuring both the Ghostbusters and Casper movies seem slim indeed. Director Ridley Scott's influence on the science fiction genre speaks for itself, and while Alien and Blade Runner are two entirely different projects, there are a few Easter eggs suggesting that they may take place in the same universe. A video screen that reads "Purge" appears in both films, for example. That may not be enough evidence to support a shared universe theory, but the 20th anniversary edition Alien DVD that was released in 1999 mentions that Captain Dallas had taken a job from the Tyrell Corporation, which is the company that develops replicants in Blade Runner. Scott later said on the Blade Runner DVD commentary that the futuristic version of Los Angeles could easily be the city that sends out the crew from Alien. While Alien takes place in the year 2122, most of the events in Prometheus take place in 2093, just a few generations after Blade Runner. So is it possible that the androids in the Alien universe were based on the replicants from Blade Runner? David certainly goes through the same kind of existential crisis that Roy Batty was dealing with.
Making you guys pretty close, huh?
Not too close, I hope.
It should also be noted that Paul W.S. Anderson's 1998 movie Soldier was intended as an unofficial sidequel to Blade Runner, both having been written by David Peoples. Among other things, Soldier features references to battles at both the Tannhauser Gate and the Shoulder of Orion. Stephen King is an incredibly prolific writer with 64 novels and over 200 short stories, giving him the well-earned nickname King of Horror. There have been many adaptations of King's work over the years, and King himself left several Easter eggs in his stories that suggest that they all take place in the same connected universe. The Man in Black from The Dark Tower has appeared in various other novels, for example, while the character Dick Halloran from The Shining used his magic to save Mike Hanlon's father before the events of It. Magic operates in similar ways throughout King's stories too, and the concept of Ka from The Dark Tower is a running theme. Does this mean that all of the movies based on King's work take place within one giant multiverse too? At this point, it seems unlikely, regardless of the fact that these adaptations have been released by many different studios. The central text within King's universe is The Dark Tower. Unfortunately, the 2017 adaptation of The Dark Tower was a colossal failure, and the Amazon series doesn't appear to be moving forward. However, any fans that still want to entertain this theory can at least track Stephen King's many cameo appearances in adaptations of his work. Seth MacFarlane is a big fan of celebrity cameos. For example, MacFarlane's Western comedy, A Million Ways to Die in the West, features a pretty amazing cameo that almost single-handedly makes it worth the watch. During a late night, Albert Stark hears some strange noises coming from a shed. When he looks inside, he finds Doc Brown working on a version of the DeLorean time machine.
What's that?
Nothing. It's a weather experiment.
This is a fun nod to the Back to the Future series, as Doc is trapped in the Old West between the events of Part 2 and Part 3. Theoretically, A Million Ways to Die in the West doesn't contradict anything that happens in the Back to the Future trilogy. Although this is nothing more than a fun cameo, it's probably the closest thing to an actual Back to the Future sequel that we are ever going to get. A few years ago, Universal Pictures tried to create a new cinematic universe featuring a number of iconic movie monsters. It was called The Dark Universe, and it never made it past the first film. The 2017 wannabe blockbuster The Mummy was intended to be the Iron Man of the Dark Universe, but the film notoriously bombed at the box office and received terrible reviews. Universal had planned to develop brand new versions of its most famous creatures and villains, but these projects were set aside after The Mummy turned out to be such a disappointment. But the Dark Universe was based on a concept that Universal Picture once perfected. Starting with 1931's Dracula, Universal created several classic monster films that were set within the same continuity, including Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, The Creature from the Black Lagoon, and The Wolfman. There were many crossover projects too. Dracula and the Invisible Man popped up in House of Frankenstein, and the three monsters encountered each other again in House of Dracula. Universal even managed to bring the comedians Bud Abbott and Lou Costello into the universe, with 3 movies that featured fun appearances and cameos from various monsters.